12-gauge investigative. Let's jump in.
All right. How's everybody doing on this Saturday night? I hope you guys are doing okay. I wanted to get on here and do a little new book special, and I want to talk about Israel Keys. I've always enjoyed this story of this individual and the cases that involve Mr. Keys, the nomadic trails of his killings, and how and trying to get into the mindset of Israel Keys, how it began, what happened, and how it ended. I came across this book and I'd love to read it, but I thought it'd be okay if you joined me along the way. So, let's start with the monster on the loose. February 2011. It had been a tough month for the residents of Anchorage, Alaska. Tensions had been running high since a young female barista disappeared from a local coffee stand on the night of the first. The girl's family was understandably worried sick when she failed to return home after her shift, and their fear only grew when they began to receive strange text messages from her. I'm going to my friend's house for a few days. Tell my dad I love him. You won't hear from me until I come home. The girl's boyfriend looked at the message in confusion. Why would she suddenly leave and not take any of her belongings with her? Which friend was she staying with? Why? These were questions with no real answers, because he knew on some level that every word was a lie. He had no way to prove his suspicions, but the more days went by without another word from her, the worse his worries grew. Posters bearing her image and information have been put up all over the area. Her father offered a $12,500 reward for information leading to the girl's return, and anyone who knew the man was sure he would have offered a lot more if he could have. He was a devoted single father, and not having her around was taking its toll on him emotionally and physically. On February 11th, over 1,000 people attended a candlelight vigil at the town square park in downtown Anchorage. It was a touching scene, people from all over the community coming together to support the family. Around that same time, another Anchorage resident was getting off a cruise ship near his hotel in New Orleans, Louisiana. He was well aware of the news surrounding the missing girl, but this hardly ruined his vacation. If anything, it had only made getting away all the more enjoyable. He was quite content with the knowledge that he had information others desperately wanted, and he was in no hurry to share it. This man knew exactly where the girl was. No, he wanted to take his sweet, sweet time. Maybe he would never tell anyone anything. It was much more fun to watch people scramble for answers that would never be found after all. The man passed through Dallas, Texas on his way back to Anchorage on the 16th. Now that his trip was over, he was getting bored again. After finding a suitable location, a 3,500 square foot house and barn, he seized the opportunity to have some fun. The man set a fire and soon both buildings were up in flames. The locals stopped in their tracks and watched as the sky turned dark with smoke. Heat warped the air. The fire was so massive that they feared it would swallow everything around it. Yet the stranger was totally unconcerned. It was as if the flame did not even exist to him. He stopped only to ask for direction before he took off. The man was excited to get home. On the 19th, he was back in Anchorage. His young daughter had also returned to school, and his girlfriend was at work. He always enjoyed his time alone. He went to his shed and opened a large cabinet. Inside lay a frozen body of the missing girl. He carefully removed her from the drawer. She was naked except for a tarp he had wrapped around her, though even this had not prevented her from making a mess inside the cabinet. The blood from the wound on her back had soaked the insulation lining the floor. Annoyed, the man cleaned up the scene and disposed of the tarp, insulation, and what was left of the girl's clothing in his fireplace. The rest of the day came and went. The man left the girl in the shed while he gathered the supplies needed for the next part of his plan. The return of his girlfriend in the following morning did not slow him down either. He had long ago made it clear to the woman that he did not like her interfering in his business. He returned to the shed after a shopping trip for a camera, makeup, fishing line, and sewing needles. Among his haul was a newspaper he had found in a dumpster. It was February 13th edition, recent enough to make his plan believable. Using the makeup, fishing line, and needles, the man set to work. It was not an easy task. Her skin had turned darker as she thawed, and the blood pooled beneath her skin. Her eyes were dull and blank, meaning they were best left closed. It took a lot of makeup and fishing line to make her look alive again. The man snapped a few photos of her with his new camera. Then he typed up a ransom note. He had seen the news and was aware how much money the girl's father was offering, but he decided it was not enough. He demanded at least $30,000 to be deposited in the girl's bank account in exchange for her return. The thought of it all made him laugh. Using the girl's phone, the man sent another text to her boyfriend, giving him direction to a park where he had left a typed note and photograph. All that was left now was to get rid of the body. Luckily, he was quite handy with a saw. On the 21st, the man headed towards Matanuska Lake with the girl's dismembered remains in tow. He walked out into the frozen surface and cut a hole in the ice before throwing her into the water. The body, held down by fishing weights, slowly sank to the bottom of the lake. After a few more hours, the man packed up his belongings. He was happy to have caught a few fish and planned to cook them for his family's dinner that night. The fun was over for now. It was time to get back to his other life. The Family, Part 2. It was a strange life from the start. Heidi Hankinson and John Jeffrey Keyes could be politely decorated as devout Christians, though others, including eventually their own son, thought of them more as religious fanatics. Originally from Torrance, California, the Keyes were loners who had become members of the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, a denomination of Mormonism often seen by outsiders as a cult. By the time the couple welcomed their second child and first son, they had relocated to Richmond, Utah. There would be many more children to come. His name was Isreal. He was born on January 7, 1978. As the oldest boy, he held a special place in the family, seemingly favored above the other children as their numbers grew. Including Isreal, the Keyes had a total of 10 children, with some names reflecting their faith: Charity, Hosanna, Isaac, America, Autumn Rose, and Sunshine. They spent the early years of their lives in Utah until the family decided to leave Mormonism behind and relocate to Colville, Washington, a city with a population of under 5,000 people. Along with their faith, the Keyes held anti-government views that intensified into extremisms as the years went by. They chose a life of self-sufficiency and isolation. Due to this distrust of hospitals and their strict rules, Heidi opted to have only home births, my bad. None of the children were to have birth certificates or social security numbers. In an effort to minimize the amount of government interference as much as possible, Father John Jeffrey, a handyman and maintenance man by trade, moved the family into a one-room cabin located on a remote stretch of land. The home had no electricity or running water, having only a wood-heated stove. All the children were homeschooled in their parents' white supremacist worldview. Though isolated from the larger outside world, the Keys were not without friends. Part of the appeal of living in Colville was the presence of like-minded people. After leaving Mormonism behind, the family attended the Ark. The Ark was a church located near the Canadian border that was adherent to Christian identity. Movement and interpretation of the Bible that claims white Western Europeans are the true descendants of the ancient Israelites, thus making them God's true chosen people. An FBI report on the movement summarizes its beliefs. One aspect of identity is interpretation of the origins of the white race. To the advocates of identity, the Bible is a history of the white race. It is taught that Adam and Eve were the first white people from whom all white people descended. God, it is believed, created Adam from the dust of the earth and then created Eve to be his own companion. Adam and Eve were placed directly into the Garden of Eden by God. Identity, therefore, views the garden as having been an actual site, the location where the white race originated. By using numerous geographic, biblical, and linguistic references, identity places the garden in Central Asia. Another identity teaching is that Adam and Eve were created only after all other races and people existed on Earth. These other races, the races of color such as the blacks, Asiatics, and Latinos, were not, according to some interpretations, created directly by God, as were Adam and Eve. Rather, they developed through a lengthy process of evolution, originating from the ashes of the earth, the residue from the earth's creation. Because the white race is God's chosen race, only whites have immortal souls, and all others are eternally damned and cannot obtain salvation. Other interpretations, however, reflect that the black race was created by God before God created Adam and Eve, and that the blacks and whites were the only original people that existed. The blacks had a specific purpose on earth, that is, to be servants to whites. Furthermore, it is concluded that all other races are the result of inbreeding between blacks and whites. Identity also states that Jews were neither created by God nor did they evolve. According to this view, the Jews are the children of Satan and the enemies of God. During the period before God's creation of Adam, Satan interbred with the races of color to produce the Asiatic Jew and the black Jew. The white Jew was created when Satan interbred with Adam's descendant. The Jews were often referred to as the children of darkness because they are the children of Satan, and there exists a battle between them and the white race, the children of light, for supremacy on earth. To explain away the irony of white supremacists naming their child Isreal, the report continues. Identity contends that the Bible is the basis upon which the United States was founded. This theory is in keeping with the view that the Bible contains God's laws for governing nations and governments. These laws, however, are only meant for God's children, that is, Israel. If the Christian identity movement sounds familiar, that is because it has been associated over the years with numerous acts of racially motivated violence, including terrorism. One of the more famous names associated with the movement is Byron de la Beckwith, a fertilizer salesman who joined the White Citizens Council after Brown versus Board of Education ruled that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. Della Beckwith is most infamous for having murdered civil rights leader Medgar Evers outside of Evers' home. He shot the man in the back with a rifle from across the street on June 12, 1963. Despite going to trial twice for the crime, Della Beckwith walked free both times due to deadlocked juries. It was not until 1973 when the FBI got word that Della Beckwith was crossing state lines into Louisiana with a car full of loaded guns, dynamite, and direction to the house of Jewish activist Adolf Ira Botnick that he finally faced some justice. Other names associated with Christian identity movement are Robert J. Matthews, a bank robber who founded the terrorist organization The Order, mass shooter Larry Gene Ashbrook, and William Potter Gale, a political activist who, much to his chagrin, had been born into a Jewish family. But there were two figures who would be particularly notable in young Israel's life, brothers Chevy and Shane Cahoe, who would go on to murder an entire family. It is easy to see why the boys became friends. The Cahoes had also come from a large family consisting of 8 siblings, themselves included. Like the Keys, they were all homeschooled, lived off the land, and belonged to the Ark. The Cahoes lived less than a mile away on Aladdin Road, making it easy for the children to spend what little free time they had together. The Cahoe family loved their guns. It was more than just an interest or necessity for them, it was a way of life, and it rubbed off on Israel. There were the typical use of hunting wild animals for food and shooting for protection, but there were also more sinister ones. Not all their weapons have been obtained legally. Some had been bought and sold on black markets. They needed to cover their tracks in preparation for a race war the Cahoe patriarch told them was on the horizon. All this talk about race wars and white supremacy mattered little to young Isreal. Though he still followed what his parents believed, he was like most children his age, far more keen on his own interests. His mother heavily monitored what he read and watched in hopes of keeping him in line, but she allowed her son to read gun magazines. He was simply fascinated with all the weaponry his friends were keeping. He wanted to learn everything he could about guns. Not long after his 6th birthday, he received one as a gift from his grandfather. The gift marked the start of a very troubling adolescence. It is unclear exactly what age Isreal was when he began acting out, but he was likely not even a teenager yet by the time he began breaking and entering homes. It was not long after this that he turned his attention to small animals, mostly cats, particularly those that annoyed him. There was a cat of ours that was always getting into the trash. It was my sister's, he would recall years later. I told her if that cat gets into the trash again, I'm going to kill it. The cat did, in fact, get into the trash again, fed up. Isreal, along with his other sister, Charity, and 2 other boys, took the cat deep into the woods. I took a piece of parachute cord and tied it to a tree. He explained. The other kids watched as Isreal wrapped the other end of the 10-foot-long cord around the animal's neck. Once it was secure, Isreal pulled out a .22 revolver, and I shot the cat in the stomach. And it ran around the tree, and then it crashed into the tree and started vomiting. And for me, I didn't really react. I actually kind of laughed a little because of the way it was running around the tree. But I looked at the kid who was around my age, and he was throwing up. Kind of traumatized, I think. The boy's reaction puzzled Isreal. How could he not find it funny? The movements and noises the cat made. Seeing dead animals was something Isreal had long gotten used to, having lived almost his whole life near the wilderness. The thought that other people had not yet gotten numb of the fact of killing was not easy for him to understand. He told his dad about it, and of course his dad talked to my parents, said Isreal. and that was pretty much the last time anyone went into the woods with me. Israel had been quite close with Charity before this. The two had a habit of getting into mischief together. They liked to shoot at their neighbors' houses with BB guns, and if there was nobody else around, they would break in. When there was nothing worth stealing, they would be content with simply moving furniture around to confuse the homeowners. A few times, Israel and Charity had even hidden in the bushes and waited until the owners arrived to jump out and spook them. They also liked to start small fires that usually went unnoticed by the adults around town. She talked too much about it, Israel later recalled with some annoyance. People found out about some of the stuff I did, like my parents and the parents of other kids who would hang out with me. So I quit doing things with her. If Israel's parents were concerned about this behavior, they did little to curb it. Any one of Israel's antics should have been cause for alarm for most families. But Heidi and John Jeffrey may not have even been aware of the extent of his crimes, and if they were, they had overlooked it. In 1963, forensic psychologist John Marshall McDonald brought up a new theory for the origins of criminal behavior. The McDonald triad refers to a series of behaviors that, when observed in children, may be predictive of future violent tendencies. These behaviors are arson, cruelty towards animals, and a chronic bedwetting. Though the idea that there could be a formula that could potentially determine who might be a dangerous criminal has been met with both controversy and skepticism in recent years, it is still often used in discussions about serial killers. It is unknown if Israel was a bedwetter, but arson and animal cruelty should have been more than enough reason for intervention. Unfortunately, the Keyes family did not trust modern medicine, and that included psychology. It was a belief that would go on to have deadly consequences in more ways than one. Chapter 3, Like Jesus. Carpentry was ideal work for someone like Israel. It was practical, profitable, and most importantly for his family. It was the kind of labor that was supposed to bring him closer to Jesus. Israel learned that what he knew from his father and work was one of the few ways two spent time together. Israel learned what he knew from his father and work was one of the few ways the two spent time together. Since Israel never went to school, he was able to refine his skills quickly. And by the age of 16, he had begun to build his own cabin a short distance from his family's home. The project took him around 2 years, from 1995 to 1997, to complete. Unlike his father, who made money building houses for other members of the church, while his own children were forced to sleep in tents, Israel built the cabin for himself. He had always been largely self-sufficient, but now he was yearning for independence. What little money he earned came from his job as a general contractor with a local business. His boss had a teenage daughter who grew close to Israel. They started off as friends, meeting up at potlucks after church. Eventually, the two began dating in secret. When her father found out, however, he reacted positively and gave the pair his blessing. In a small town with limited prospects for marriage, a hard worker like Israel must have been quite the catch. Unfortunately, Israel's own parents were not as accepting. What exactly they disapproved of in the relationship is unclear, but their disdain was enough to forbid Israel from seeing her again, so Israel broke up with the girl. Or so he told them. He and the girl, whose name had never been released to the public, could no longer see each other as often as they liked, but they kept in contact through writing letters. Meddling with his first relationship was the final straw. He was not ready to leave them completely, but he needed to have his own space for once. When it came to feeding himself, he took up hunting. I would hunt anything with a heartbeat, he would later recall. Unsurprisingly, he became quite good at it. Hunting required patience and a nerve to kill a living creature. Traits Israel had in spades: the wait, the stalking, the observing. It was all almost as thrilling as the final act. He memorized the sounds animals made and what they meant, how to gauge the distance between them and himself, and most of all, how to hide. He was soon able to keep himself still for long stretches of time. Knowing how to stay out of sight was vital. One wrong move could send an animal running. And then, what would he eat that day? Even now that he had moved out, his family still relied on him. Any deer he hunted would get butchered, dressed, and sent to his parents so as many siblings could have food. Israel enjoyed hunting very much, but nobody around him knew the true reasons behind his newfound passion. Things took a turn when he was just 16. During a trip into town, he was caught shoplifting. Jeff and Heidi were furious. Not only had their precious son committed the sin of theft, but it also made them look bad in front of the community. Local authorities had sentenced Israel to community service, but his parents did not believe this was sufficient punishment. They ordered him to do manual labor, such as chopping firewood to pay back the value of the items he had stolen. The Keys family was in for a second shock when they went to Israel's cabin and discovered that he had been hoarding several guns, all of which had been acquired through dubious means. Now there was more to worry about than the broken laws. Just what kind of person was their golden child turning into? Israel would also claim to have committed his first bank robbery around this time, but there were no records of such a crime having occurred to match his statements. Heidi had never been happy about her son moving out at such a young age. As a teenager, he still needed his family. More importantly, they needed him. She believed it was healthier for him to come back, and soon they succeeded in convincing him, if only for a short time. Statements later made by Israel implied that his complicated feelings about his childhood began long before the incident occurred, but his mother considered this to be the turning point in his life. Sure, he had gotten into some trouble before, but that didn't happen. But didn't that happen to all boys at some point? Heidi never made any mention of the dead cats. Perhaps she was in denial and may have been kept in the dark about reports of arson. It puzzled her as to why he was suddenly acting so strangely. If the Keys had to come up with an explanation, it was that Israel had turned his back on God. This suspicion was confirmed not long after he was forced to return to them. He and Heidi were riding in his truck during a trip into town. It had been a quiet drive until Israel suddenly turned to her and asked, "Mom, has it ever crossed your mind that all of your children might not choose to live the way you and Dad live?" Heidi was stunned. "Israel," she began, "you don't know what you're saying." He pressed on, "Well, we're not going to necessarily want to do the way you and Dad had lived." Where was this coming from? Heidi could not understand why Israel, or any of her other children, for that matter, would want to live differently. She believed that they had raised them well. Their lives had not always been comfortable, but that was for the best. It made them resourceful and tough. They did not discuss the matter any further, but a seed of doubt had already been planted in Heidi's mind. Her worst fears were coming true. And when her daughters looked like they were going to follow in their brother's footsteps, she knew something drastic needed to be done. In a testimony written in 2011 for her church, Autumn Rose Keys recounted, "Around the age of 11 and 12, my heart turned in rebellion toward my parents. My two older sisters and I were in a kind of revolt against them. We had friends they did not like, we secretly listened to music they forbade, and we got away with as much as we could. My conviction from early on was, of course I am a Christian. No one ever questioned me that I can remember. At 13, I fell into grievous sin with my parents that my parents did not know about. I began to doubt God's existence and planned to leave my family as soon as possible and dive headfirst into sin. I've thanked God many times for my earthly father, who was a strict man. Autumn Rose's testimony, along with Maureen Callahan's book, American Predator: The Hunt for the Most Meticulous Serial Killer of the 21st Century, are some of the few sources that briefly touch on the reaction of the Keys patriarch. Because of this, it may be easy to assume that John Jeffrey Keyes was the more passive parent, the kind to take the backseat to his wife's well-known intensity, but the truth was that he was very much the head of the household. The family had little choice but to comply with his demands. This included, at least for a few months, the disowning of Israel after he renounced his faith. In response, the Keys packed up their belongings and headed to Oregon. They settled in Maupin, a small city located along the Deschutes River. Israel did not go with them. Though leaving their son behind was painful for Heidi, the separation provided Israel with some much-needed alone time. He had long known that he was not happy with his life, but now he was realizing just how bad things were. His family was too dependent on him. His own parents expected him to provide everything for his many siblings, and it was not just money and food they had to give. Israel had practically raised the younger children. Her father was too busy building homes for clients while Heidi was exhausted from giving birth again and again. They had to live in tents for long stretches of time, constantly cold and hungry, their feet becoming deformed from the hand-me-down shoes they had outgrown. Israel struggled to create order out of the chaos, but for the most part, he succeeded. He kept his siblings alive and in line with God. But it had gotten to be too much. Israel was only a teenager, after all. He sought comfort from his girlfriend. She had noticed how entangled the Keys were, and she found it strange. Heidi's bond with him came across as borderline incestuous, as though she had been trying to get her son to play the role of husband and father that John Jeffrey was neglecting. The girlfriend was hoping this would someday change because she and Israel had plans for the future. Someday, he would get over his sinful thoughts he had about the relationships and they could get married and start their own construction company. That bright future would be farther away than she had hoped because Israel decided to leave her behind and follow his family to Maupin. Chapter 4, Julie. Also living in Colville, Washington at the time was a girl named Julie Harris. In 1996, she was a spunky preteen, a 12-year-old with a sense of humor about herself. Friends described her as having a great spirit, a trait evidenced by her status as a Special Olympic champion. Julie's bedroom was full of trophies, and she had even won a gold medal for downhill skiing. Julie had been born in the spring of 1983. When she was still a toddler, she was struck with a severe fever and was later diagnosed with a rare blood disorder. Her short life had been filled with surgeries, ranging from skin graft to the amputation of both her legs up to the knee. Though she spent much of her time in a wheelchair, she was hardly daunted by her disability. She had artificial legs to walk on. She loved to challenge people by telling them she could take them off and walk without them. They would laugh, but she would end up taking them off and walking on her ends of the legs, which she was very good at. One of her friends would recall later. The looks on their faces were priceless. She and I would always laugh and have a great time. Julie was, in nearly all respects, a typical preteen girl. She liked reading comic books and enjoyed spending time with her friends. Unfortunately, that also meant she was vulnerable to as any other child, to the insecurities of adolescence. As she got older, Julie could not help but become increasingly self-conscious of her disability. I really felt bad for her, her mother, Sherry Odegaard, told the Q6 Cold Case podcast. All the boys that she liked her, but they didn't like her because she had no feet. In the time leading up to her disappearance, Julie's usual bright and bubbly personality had darkened. She had been a good student, but her grades were starting to slip. It all came to a head on the night of March 2nd, 1996. When I told her she could do Special Olympic skiing, I told her she needed to keep her grades up. Sherry told KHQ Local News that was the deal. She had F's, so she couldn't go. Having to miss out on skiing devastated Julie. It was made worse by the fact that her mother was still taking Julie's younger brother, who was also involved in the Special Olympics, on a trip without her. This argument was the last conversation Sherry would ever have with her daughter. Julie remained home with Don Sachs, Julie's mother's then boyfriend. According to Sachs, had been trying to convince Julie to do her homework. When she became upset again, she cried and told Sachs to go to hell. Angered, Sachs then went to her room. It is believed that Julie set her alarm for 5:20 in the morning and went to bed. Sachs, who left early that morning to go fishing, claimed that the girl was still in bed by the time he left. A police report listing Julie as a runaway recounted that Julie then got up, dressed herself in a black skirt and pink and black striped sweater, grabbed a few slices of leftover pizza, and then left the house. She loved God. She went to church all the time, Sherry explained, and that's what she was doing the day this happened. She always waited. The people up the road would take her to church. It did not appear that Julie ever made it to church, and by the time Sachs returned home, there was no sign that she had ever come back to the house. Either Julie was gone. The news quickly reached Sherry. She was struck with so much worry that she needed to be hospitalized. There was one last possible sighting of Julie. The witness claimed to have seen her walking in town while in the company of a tall man wearing a long trench coat and hat, a description as vague as it was ominous, and the case came to a standstill. On April 9th, a group of children playing along the mouth of the Colville River made a startling discovery: Julie's bag and prosthetic feet on the shore. But Sherry tried her best to remain hopeful, even when the investigation shifted from locating a runaway to a possible homicide case. Though it was not ideal for Julie to be without her wheelchair or prosthetics, she could still get around on her stumps. I don't feel that she's dead, said Sherry. My heart doesn't feel that she's dead. A mother knows these things. I think she's in Oregon. All they're looking for is a homicide. They're not looking for a live child. Sherry believed that Julie had run away and had gone into hiding with friends. The worst possible scenario she allowed herself to believe was that she had been kidnapped. She held tight to this belief for about 6 months. At the same time, the police investigation had thrown her and her family's lives into turmoil. Suspicion immediately fell on Don Sachs, something that Sherry took issue with. She claimed that the relationship between Sachs and her daughter had been a good one, and that Julie had loved him like a teddy bear. She also claimed that she herself had been arrested about 4 or 5 times because authorities believed that she and her boyfriend knew more about Julie's disappearance than they had let on. The fact that Sachs later faced a fourth-degree domestic violence charge in 1997 for allegedly assaulting one of Julie's younger brothers did not help their case. Sachs was said to have grabbed the boy by the neck, headbutted him, and kicked him in the leg. However, Sachs maintained that he had simply been trying to restrain the boy during a heated argument, and it did not appear that he ever actually convicted of any crime. Coincidentally, the argument was reportedly also about homework. 6 months after Julie vanished, Sherry suddenly felt her sense of hope disappear as well. It had been in the middle of the day, she recalled, and she had been walking through a park when the thought that Julie was dead finally hit her. She collapsed to her knees, screaming and crying. She later found out that from a friend, that Julie's body had been found. On April 26, 1997, Julie's unburied body was found by a group of children playing in a rural area near Holler Creek Road. Her remains were in poor condition. Fully skeletonized, police managed to identify her using dental records. Because of this, it was extremely difficult to determine an exact cause of death, but there was a big clue. According to Sherry, Julie had been found with a rope tied around her neck. The identity of Julie's killer remains a mystery. At the time of this writing, Don Sachs is still considered to be a person of interest in the case, though police have stated that there is not enough evidence to either charge or dismiss him. There's also not enough evidence to move forward with any other possible suspects. Sherry Aldegarde still maintains infrequent contact with her now ex-boyfriend Sachs. She also not changed her mind about his innocence. She has someone else in mind. Years later, when watching the news, she saw a familiar face, that of Isreal Keys. He had been a teenager in 1996, and though she had seen him around the town a few times, she had never known him or his family personally. But just because she did not know him did not mean that Julie could not have said the same. I do remember him up at this house that Julie liked to go to because there was this girl that she liked to play with. I didn't like him, Sherry explained. It was just that icky feeling. Memories of the strange teenager came flooding back. Sherry found herself making connections she would never have thought of otherwise. Julie's best friend had seen him at the pool during their swimming lessons. I know he'd have walked by a couple times. I just never allowed Julie outside any time he walked. Sherry continued, he just creeped me out. Sherry's theory is that Isreal may have used Julie's insecurities to manipulate her. If an older boy was flirting with her, she may have been flattered enough to sneak off with him. As for a motive, Sherry believes that Julie's disability may have had something to do with it. Women are no good if they don't have all their body parts. Once I heard all that, I started putting things together because why would he keep stalking her and following her around? Because he didn't believe that she needed to exist, so I believed he planned to do it. I do. Could Julie Harris have been Isreal Keys' first victim? Chapter 5, The Trailer. The first thing I ever burned down was a trailer. It was an alarming confession, but one that would not be made until several years after the fact. Isreal had never been that kind of person to willingly relinquish power to any situation. It was an alarming confession, but one that would not be made until several years after the fact. Isreal had never been the kind of person to willingly relinquish power in any situation. Even as an adult in custody, seated in an interrogation room across the FBI agents, he thought only of how to make the circumstances work in his favor. If they wanted any information at all, whether it was about his life or possibly crimes, they would have to work hard for it. And he was determined to make it an agonizing process. His game was simple. Tell them something vague, something intriguing enough to get investigators worked up, but do it slowly. When he was not keeping quiet, he only gave them bits of information to keep them frustrated. And then maybe, if he was feeling particularly generous, he would drop another tiny detail. Given what he would later be accused of, it's hardly surprising that this confession would have gone overlooked at the time. After all, this was not a murder he was admitting to, but arson. A major crime, yes, but at the time, one that paled in comparison to the others. It was a It was something he did as a teenager, long before he had taken the body of a missing girl out to a frozen lake. It would not be until later that this mysterious crime would be looked at with greater interest. Investigators, professionals, and internet armchair detectives alike would find themselves retracing Israel's steps. Here's what is known. Israel had a tumultuous childhood, and his adolescence was seemingly no better. Out of necessity, became fiercely independent and self-reliant at an age when most of us would still be under the watchful eye of our parents. He had an unsettling interest in harming other living creatures and had learned that this was a hobby that was best indulged in when he was alone. We also know that Israel stayed in Colville, Washington by himself for an unclear amount of time before joining his family in Oregon in 1997. Without a brood of siblings to look after, he would have had a lot more free time. Could he have taken advantage of his newfound solitude to partake in something far darker than hunting animals? Looking back at the unsolved crimes that occurred in the Colville area in 1997, there's one particularly gruesome case, the details of which may seem eerily familiar. Marlene Emerson was a woman already known to local law enforcement. In previous months, the 29-year-old had spent some time in jail for a second-degree burglary charge. She and a male acquaintance were arrested after they broke into a tattoo parlor with the intent of stealing some expensive equipment. The man's wife apparently had aspirations of becoming a tattoo artist, and this was their way of getting her started. Marlene also had a long history of drug abuse, dating back to at least 1990. It was bad enough that the Superior Court had to get involved when it came to the care of her daughter, Cassie Emerson. The girl had already been living with her aunt, Connie Barnhill, but was officially handed over to her when the judge determined that living with her mother would have put Cassie in danger. It was a prediction that unfortunately came true. Cassie was returned to her mother in early 1996. The girl, now a preteen, had just settled in with her mother, came under the police's radar yet again. The relationship between Marlene and her live-in boyfriend had turned sour, leading her to get a restraining order against them. It was this boyfriend who immediately became a suspect when, in the early hours of June 25, 1997, the trailer Marlene and Cassie had moved in just 3 months earlier burned to the ground. Firefighters arrived at Panorama Mobile Home Park, and once the fire was fully extinguished, spent the next several hours inspecting the area. Within the charred remains of the trailer, they found human remains belonging to an adult woman. An autopsy eventually determined to be Marlene Emerson, though her exact cause of death was difficult to determine. But where was Cassie? Nothing found at the scene indicated that there had been anyone else in the trailer during the fire, which had occurred in the middle of the night. If the 12-year-old had not been home during these hours, then where else could she have possibly been? Cassie's absence implied another grim possibility. Someone must have taken her. Marlene's unnamed ex-boyfriend would be ruled out as a suspect rather quickly. Unfortunately, this did not do much in narrowing down who could have done it. "We've got suspicions," said Gilbert Greer, then the undersheriff of the local police department. She'd, Marlene, been in quite a lot of trouble over the years. Marlene had a lot of people who didn't get along with her. Other than the boyfriend, the police had plenty of other acquaintances to look into. Among those was Cassie's own biological father, a man who had never been part of the girl's life and had reportedly abandoned her after she was born. There was also Connie Barnhill, Cassie's aunt and Marlene's sister. There had been some bad blood between the two women following the custody arrangement, resulting in what had been described as a bitter fight, and in order from the judge for them to stay away from each other. But that happened a long time ago in 1991. Connie loved her niece, and the sisters eventually made up. Cassie was still in frequent contact with her aunt, so there was no reason for the girl to have been abducted by her, and Connie was ruled out. Similarly, Cassie's father was also determined to have nothing to do with either the fire or the girl's disappearance. Police were back to square one. Perhaps due to the brutality of the crime, they were operating under the belief that whoever was responsible had to have been someone Marlene knew. The possibility that this could have been committed by a total stranger does not appear to have been investigated with much interest at the time. Not that it would have taken them anywhere if they had. How do you chase an unknown person? If this had been a random crime, one done out of the opportunity rather than resentment, then they may as well have been looking for a ghost. Naturally, police priorities shifted towards finding Cassie alive. They offered the public a $5,000 reward to anyone who came forward with information leading to her safe return. Cassie's maternal grandmother, Elaine Williams, pleaded for her safe return, emphasizing to any of Marlene's potential enemies that her granddaughter did not know anything. The case came to a standstill for over a month. Then in late July, Cassie's remains were discovered in a wooded area only 3 miles away from Panorama Home Park. The body was in poor condition, partly due to the summer heat speeding up decomposition. There had also been major interference by wild animals. Coroner Jerry Weddle described the body as having been mauled. Investigators were only able to make a positive identification by comparing the teeth to Cassie's dental records. If she had been sexually assaulted, it was impossible to tell. The advanced decomposition presented another problem. Nobody could tell exactly how Cassie had died. This was clearly a homicide, but that alone did not offer police much to go on. The specifics of a murder can be very telling. Though not an exact rule, it is often thought that you can infer something about the relationship of the victim and perpetrator based on the nature of the killing. A gunshot, for example, is generally much quicker and less personal than a stabbing or strangulation. There were no gunshot wounds on Cassie's body, at the very least, so this was from an interpersonal crime, done by someone known to the family, as police believe. Did one of Marlene's enemies kill her and her daughter in a twisted act of revenge? Unfortunately, it was impossible to prove either way, and the case could move no further. As of the time of this writing in 2024, the double murder of Marlene and Cassie Emerson remains unsolved. It remains a subject of speculation, though one name constantly pops up: Isreal Keys. A scorched trailer in Colville, occurring during his last year there, is already enough to raise eyebrows. Israel was also an adult, having turned 19 that January 1997. We know that his violent tendencies worsened as he got older, but was he capable of such a crime? Israel would have already moved to Oregon by this time, or at least have been in the process of moving, but he was known to have traveled back to Colville frequently, Specifically, a later interview with his then girlfriend revealed that he was visiting her in the summer of 1997. The news of Marlene and Cassie's murders brought back attention to the disappearance of Julie Harris the previous years. Julie's remains were found just a few months before. Like Cassie, she had been left in a remote area. Both cases were complicated by advanced decomposition, and the mysterious circumstances surrounding their death made it difficult to point fingers at any one person. Israel Keys, the boy from Colville, had been committing increasingly serious crimes for years. But who was the first victim of this modern boogeyman, Israel Keys, the serial killer? He was well aware that investigators were itching for that information, which is exactly why he would never tell. To him, that name was just one in a vast treasure trove of secrets. And this is where I'm going to stop for today. You know, Israel, let me put him back up here. I didn't mean to close him out. Israel Keys, it has been identified that, like the book stated, he would play games with the FBI. He would only give them so much and then retract his information, or only make them try harder to get more information out of him. It's really interesting how this reading is detailing his sadistic side. As early as his teen years, 16 to be exact, is when he moved out of his parents' home and started his independence, stockpiling weapons and becoming an avid hunter. Do you believe that he moved on from deer and game like that to human beings? And one particular piece of interesting evidence, he didn't have a birth certificate or a social security number. And that'll come into play later on. But as for now, thank you so much for your time and your patience. And I hope that you enjoyed this. Maestro, cue that music.